Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to give folks a few minutes to finish joining and getting signed in, and we're going to begin in about a minute. Stand by. Thank you for joining. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, we would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the Maximize icon at the top right of the widget by dragging the bottom right corner. Panel. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available one day after the webcast using the same audience link to join today's event. A copy of today's slide deck is available on the resource list widget, indicated by that green file icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during this session, you can click on the purple Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your questions. I'll ask questions many times during the event. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. It covers common technical issues. You can also submit technical issues via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command-R on Macs. We will be using the group chat feature represented by the blue chat icon. During the presentation, during pauses called Think Time, we'll be asking you to respond in the group chat. Please note, the group chat is not associated with your name or your organization. We will also pause for polls during the presentation. Polls will appear directly on your screen. Finally, at the end of the webinar, please take the short survey so you can gather feedback on this webinar. I'd like to introduce now Lauren Murphy. Lauren, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Lauren Murphy, a researcher at Mathematica, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Annie Bonaspina, and we'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining what will be an interactive webinar on Measurement and Continuous Quality Improvement, or CQI. This is the fourth in a series of planned webinars that will occur throughout the remainder of this year to help introduce SRAE grantees to a range of data capacity and evaluation topics. This webinar builds upon our June 30th webinar, which introduced terms and processes of CQI. In this webinar, we will discuss measurement and walk through some processes of CQI in more detail. These webinars are planned as part of the SRAE National Evaluation. The recording from today's webinar will be available for viewing in a few days. We will also upload the slides from today's webinar to the SRAENE website. And the recording and slides from the June 30th Foundations of CQI webinar, which I noted, are also available on the SRAENE website. This work is occurring as part of a contract held by Mathematica and its subcontractor Public Strategies for the SRAE National Evaluation. The content we'll cover during today's webinar does not necessarily reflect HHS policy or requirements. Any of the commercially available tools mentioned today do not imply endorsement by the U.S. government. As I mentioned earlier, we have an interactive webinar planned for today that will expand upon some processes and measurement for continuous quality improvement to support your work. There are 4 different ways in which we will ask for some participation and interaction throughout today's presentation. First, we're going to pause throughout the presentation for thinking time and reflection. Next, we'll ask you to respond to some polls, and those polls will pop up on your screen. Also, we have a group chat feature. We'll ask you to share some reflections. And finally, we will respond to questions that come in through the Q&A widget. And we do ask if you have technical difficulties to make sure you post those in the Q&A widget rather than the chat box so we can find and address those quickly. And then when we do move on to the group chat, make sure you post those in the group chat and not the Q&A so that we can share information. So let's go over our learning objectives for the day. By the end of the presentation, we want you to be familiar with measurement for improvement and understand how it differs from measurement for accountability and research. We hope you become familiar with the types of measures that are critical to CQI, as well as the data sources to support measurement for improvement. Finally, we want you to become familiar with how to use measures to support road testing and monitoring in your improvement work. We hope that you find activities discussed today helpful in your work, but want to note they are optional and you are not required to use them. Before we start discussing measurement for improvement, we'd like to review the CQI cycle and processes. We are defining CQI as ongoing processes that help you identify and analyze both strengths and challenges. The processes are used to implement, test, and refine solutions for those challenges, which will ultimately help strengthen your program. The CQI processes happen through a cycle that is driven by a core set of staff which form the implementation team. This team steers the improvement work through the following steps: planning, strategy development, testing, assessing, and implementing. The first step in the cycle is planning, which can be thought about as identifying and understanding your areas for improvement. After you've planned which challenge you'd like to improve, the next step is strategy development. Here, you identify and prioritize the strategies that you'd like to test. Most of this webinar will focus on the next 3 steps, the first of which is the testing step. Here, you will develop your plan to road test your identified strategy. In this step, you will plan out an implementation and data collection approach. Later, we will discuss some of the data collection approaches. Once you have your plan in place, you will conduct 1 or more road test cycles. After you test, you assess your results of the road test by analyzing the feedback and deciding on next steps. This could be adopting the strategy, adapting the strategy, or abandoning the strategy. But once your road tests indicate an approach that you'd want to adopt, you'd move into the implementation strategy step. And within this step, you continue to monitor progress through the measurement. So, this leads us on to the purpose of measurement. And as you will see, there are a couple purposes that we want you to consider. The 3 purposes of measurement include improvement, accountability, and research. This presentation will focus on the purpose of improvement, but it's important to understand the different purposes and how measures could overlap between purposes. First, measurement for improvement is designed to evaluate changes in practices, meaning it's to check to see if strategies you identified and are implementing in the CQI process are working. Measurement for accountability is meant to recognize the exemplary or problematic performances. For instance, you might try to identify sites with the highest or lowest retention rates. Finally, measurement for research is about testing theories and assessing relationships between variables. For example, based on your logic model, you might measure if the outputs are related to short-term outcomes. So let's discuss measurement for improvement more and start to tease out how this differs from accountability and research. First off, as I said, the measurement for improvement is to evaluate changes in practices and to identify promising strategies. Through the CQI cycle, you will be implementing new strategies to resolve challenges and need to determine if they are working. Since you are measuring the strategies, the results of the measurement should be relevant to the frontline staff implementing those strategies. Staff are going to want to know if the strategies are working and if they should continue to implement. In terms of timing and frequency, you want to be measuring whenever you test out new strategies. Measures should be timely and embedded in daily workflows. As you'll see later in the presentation, you'll use these measures as part of road tests and learning cycles. These are multiple tests to check the strategies with different cohorts and to build the evidence if the strategy is working. To keep the measurement timely, you only need a small sample size. You need just enough data to assess if the strategy is working. This could look like a short exit ticket, maybe with just one class of participants. Finally, these measurements are low stakes. You're trying to learn if the challenge is being resolved, and that data needs to be good enough to give an assessment. And we'll talk about the specific data types and sources later in this presentation. So you might be asking now, how is this different from accountability? Generally, measurement for accountability is for external stakeholders and may be required through grant monitoring and reporting. Therefore, the measurement is typically occurring once or twice a year. And I say typically because we know there are some measures that need to be collected more frequently, such as attendance. However, when measuring for accountability, you might not assess the measures frequently. You might only assess quarterly or when submitting a grant report. Next, there's no theory in terms of what you're testing. You're testing the overall performance of your program to see how the program is performing. You may then use these data to identify exemplary or problematic performers. Because you're looking at the overall program, your sample size is 100% of your program, rather than measuring specific sites or cohorts. Finally, as these measures are used for grant reporting, these measures align with required performance measures. Finally, let's see how measurement for improvement differs from measurement for research. Measurement for research is meant to inform the field. The results are tended to be external, for instance, published in a peer-reviewed journal or presented through conferences. Measurement for improvement, on the other hand, is more internal. You're sharing results with the program team and the frontline staff. In measurement for research, you're developing and testing theories about relationships between conceptual variables. This occurs through one large test of theories, opposed to sequential tests as part of the CQI road tests. Next, the data that is collected is comprehensive and can be referred to as just-in-case data. This means you collect everything you can, so you have enough data to examine at the end of an evaluation. You want as much data as you can, just in case you need it. And when doing measurement for research, you want your measures to be regarded as credible. Therefore, it's important your design and measures meet the scientific standards of rigor that are held in the field. So, this leads us to our first thinking time and into our first poll. We want you to pause and reflect upon the different purposes for which you are collecting data. Think about all the different data you're collecting and for which purposes you are using them. And we want you to feel free to select all that apply in the poll that will pop up in a moment. We want you to think about measurement for improvement, accountability, and research. So please take a moment to respond. The poll should now pop up on your screen, and if you don't see it, you may need to refresh your browser by pressing F5 or Command R on Macs. I'll give you a moment to think about. Once again, you can select all that apply. Right? See what everyone's been doing. All right. So nearly all are using measurement for improvement work. 75% also using it for accountability, and fewer, about 39%, for research. So most of you have indicated that you're using measurement for improvement work. So we want to hear about how. So this will be our first group chat. Please take a moment to think, and then using the group chat window, the chat box, please share with us the ways that your program has engaged in measurement for improvement. Make sure you're using the chat box window, that's indicated with the blue box, rather than the Q&A widget. Group chat allows others to see your responses, so we can share with one another. Okay, we'll give you time to reflect on that and for answers to start coming through. right, here we go. We have some people using satisfaction surveys, EQI surveys, exit surveys, pre-post data. And while surveys I will note that we'll talk about later that surveys, it's thinking about the purpose of those. So survey data could be used for all three of the purposes. So maybe you are using it for improvement work, but you could also be using it for accountability as well as research. So that's an interesting one. We got some customer satisfaction, completion rates, more surveys, looking through. Someone uses this to set goals, and then they use the data to then track the progress on these goals. Great. Feedback, observation, site satisfaction. All right. Great. So, and we're definitely going to talk about some of these types of measures a little bit, the data sources as well. So, as I mentioned, although there are different purposes for measurement, it doesn't mean that the data sources collected can't be used for multiple purposes. That data is very valuable and can be used for more than one reason. The measures you may be collecting for accountability or research purposes could support improvement work as well. For instance, performance measures collected for accountability purposes could be useful in identifying challenges for improvement work. Maybe you're noticing that certain cohorts aren't getting the intended dosage, and that might be a challenge that you need to address. Or you may already be collecting observation data as part of a process evaluation and can use that data to assess outcomes after implementing a strategy. However, not all measures can support all multiple purposes, and sometimes you may need specific measures to support improvement work. When conducting road tests in the CQI process, you want to make sure that the measures you are using align directly with the new strategies you're implementing and are timely and accessible. Although you may be conducting a post-test survey for research or accountability purposes, that might not be timely enough to have specific items you need to assess a strategy. Therefore, you may need another measure to assess during a road test, and we'll talk more about these different types of measures and data sources shortly. So moving on from the purposes of a measure, let's talk about the types of measures used for improvement work. There are 4 types of measures that are used in improvement work. These include process measures, on track, also known as interim measures, outcome measures, and balancing measures. Over the next few slides, I'll define each of these measures and provide some examples. And in order to provide some concrete examples, we're going to present a specific scenario in which we will need to use these measures. So I'll lay out our scenario, the one I want you to think about as we're going through the different types of measures. So in our scenario, our implementation team has already gone through the early steps of the CQI process and are getting ready to test and assess. The implementation team determines the challenge that needs to be addressed is chronically absent participants, and we believe that the root cause of the absenteeism is due to a lack of belonging and connection to the program. So, to address the chronic absenteeism, we plan to implement a strategy in which facilitators send text messages to students who are absent immediately following their absence from a session. We would expect this to provide a connection to the program, and that will meet our ultimate aim of increased attendance. So keeping this scenario in mind, we're going to start walking through the 4 types of measures. First off are the process measures, which are used to answer the question of what happened. Here, you identify how the strategy was implemented. So in our scenario, we want to know, did all the absent students receive a text message? How soon after they missed the sessions were text messages sent? What was the nature of these texts, and what did the facilitators say? These measures are getting at if the strategy was implemented, how it was implemented, and what did it look like in practice. Later, when assessing whether to implement a strategy, you want to know exactly what you implemented. Next up are the on-track, also called interim measures. These are intended to ask, did the strategy influence interim outcomes that are the drivers of the ultimate aim? So if we're trying to address the root cause of our challenge, then we want to assess these interim outcomes related to the cause. In our scenario, the strategy was intended to address the root cause of not feeling connected. And we thought not feeling connected was the reason for the absenteeism. So the interim measures we want to look for, the on-track measures, asks, did the text help absent students feel more connected to the facilitators? Do they feel more connected to the program? Trying to assess if we're on track to meet the ultimate aim. Next are the outcome measures, and these are the measures that most people are familiar with. These ask, did the strategy influence the ultimate aim? We want to know, did we improve our problem? In our scenario, after we've implemented the text messages, we're going to assess whether we fixed the chronic absentee issue and did we meet our ultimate aim of improving attendance. So our questions ask, did attendance improve? Are there fewer chronically absent participants? This is saying, did we meet our outcomes? And last are the balancing measures. These ask, did the strategy impact other parts of the program? Were there unintended consequences? Although you may fix the initial challenge, you want to make sure your strategy didn't cause additional challenges. You want to make sure your program is still implemented with fidelity. So looking back at our example, we are asking facilitators to send additional text messages to youth. So to find out if we're impacting other parts of our program, we might ask facilitators, did they have time to implement the strategy? Did the added task of tracking and outreach take away from other tasks? These measures help to see if our strategy caused other challenges in our program. So to recap all the 4 measures, they're asking, first, what happened? Did you influence drivers? Did you influence the ultimate aim? And did you influence other aspects of the program? So now we'd like you to practice applying these concepts and applying these 4 measures. So we're going to present another example scenario for you to consider and then try to apply these measures. In this scenario, our challenge is facilitators are experiencing a lot of classroom disruptions. And so our overall strategy to address this issue is that we want to reduce disruptions is to be intentional about developing a partnership with the classroom teacher to help with classroom management. And the specific steps we're going to implement are, before the cohort begins, we meet with the teachers to review lessons and explicitly discuss the teacher's role in classroom management. And then we debrief with the teacher after each session. So once again, we're trying to address classroom disruptions, and we want to have classroom teachers help with the classroom management. So keeping the strategy in mind, we want you to think how you could use each type of measure to assess the strategy. And we're going to use the chat box, and we'll go one by one to give time to think between each type of measure. So once again, with the strategy of being intentional about developing a partnership with the classroom teacher to help with classroom management, what are some process measures or questions you might ask with process measures to see how your strategy is being implemented, to test our strategy? So once again, using the chat box feature, the group chat, please let us know some process questions that you could ask about this strategy. A reminder, process measures are asking what happened. Everyone some thinking time. So people are meeting with the teachers. All right, here's one where we're be able to gather the correct contact information for the students. Yes. Classroom fidelity. No. And depending on how that's interpreted, that might actually want to be more of a balancing measure of seeing if other things were impacted. Once again, the process measures are kind of thinking about what happened. So, okay, so people are saying, is attendance taking? Yes. So, what happened? Is attendance being documented? Is that how we're able to tell if teachers are able to happen? But I think we want to, once again, this one's really focusing on the disruptions, so classroom behaviors. Here's observation survey. Here are the responses to see where perspectives differ. So some of the process measures that we were thinking about for this scenario about having teachers help with classroom management, we're thinking about are the meetings actually happening? So we were saying we're going to meet with teachers before the cohorts to review lessons and really explicitly talk about teachers' role in the management and then debrief afterwards. So we want to ask, are these meetings happening? Are the teachers being responsible? Are they following through on that? Once again, the process measures are trying to figure out what is happening in our strategy. That's kind of what they're asking. So let's move on to some on-track or interim measures. So thinking about, are we influencing our interim drivers? We're trying to help with classroom management, and so we want to get our to reduce disruptions. So we think classroom management is our issue, so we want to see if we're assessing that. So our driver is getting teachers more involved. So think about some questions you might ask that are on-track measures, and please put those into the group chat. And as you're thinking through, I'll provide an example of one of the on-track measures that we were thinking about was, are the teachers feeling more involved or connected to the program? Maybe we ask the teachers to be more involved, and so we'll find out, do they feel more involved, or are they connected to the program? What others are saying. Right, so our students paying attention. So we're saying, was there a change in student behaviors? And depending on what type of change we're measuring, that might even actually become an outcome measure rather than an interim measure. So if we're starting to think of the ultimate aim was to reduce behavior disruptions, that might actually be thought of as an outcome, but depending on what change we're actually measuring, maybe it's an interim measure. Maybe we're measuring engagement or something like that behavior change. So they're just capturing attention. Okay, great. Looks like we're getting a lot of questions in here. All right. Let's move on to some outcome measures, trying to figure out where we're meeting our ultimate aim. So let's think through some outcome questions that we'd ask, an outcome measure. Give you some time to think about some outcomes. And our example maybe for this scenario would be measuring reduction in behavioral disruptions. Yep, there we go, reduce behavioral disruptions. That was our ultimate aim. So that is what our outcome measure is trying to assess. Another moment to see if anything else comes through. Percentage of behavioral improvements. There you go. Keep responding to some outcome measures, but I now want you to think on some balancing measures. Once again, now the balancing measures are the measures you're seeing if you influenced other aspects of your program with their new strategy. So not just related to the behaviorals, but other things that may have been impacted by having teachers in the group. I think someone mentioned this earlier on, is that someone mentioned that they would actually use teachers as a last resort. They would try to have facilitators deal with classroom management first, and maybe having teachers involved might be a balancing measure. Maybe you want to know, getting teachers impacting something in a different way. Let's see what we got. Oh. Student interaction, more involved. Okay, so that would more busy work for teachers. Okay, more work for busy teachers. Yes, that's the one. Yeah, so you want to see, if you asking teachers to get involved, maybe this is a negative impact on the teachers, that they don't have time to do this, that we're giving them more work. Maybe it's also more work for the facilitators, since they're meeting with teachers beforehand and after, and they're debriefing afterwards. So it's maybe it's impacting things differently in terms of time, so they don't have time to do other tasks related to the program. Okay, so once again, the balancing measures are thinking through how other aspects of the program, yes. Are you able to now present more of the material? Great, so the strategy, getting teachers involved, that leaves maybe facilitators can present more. That's great. So we're going to go through some more scenarios later, so we'll have more time for group chat. But I want to thank everyone for their insight now, and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to pass the presentation over to Annie, who will discuss some data sources to support improvement work and walk through applying measurement to support road testing. So Annie, I'll pass this over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so now, as Lauren mentioned, we're going to look at some of the data collection methods that you could use to support improvement measurement. So many of you are already probably using a lot of these, but we're going to talk about program administrative data, surveys, and then qualitative data via interviews, focus groups, and observations. Let's start with the easiest one, which is the data that you're already collecting for your program. So this would include things like your attendance data, participant attendance, the demographics of who is enrolling in your program, some enrollment information, services data. So if you offer any individual services outside of your group sessions, like referrals or wraparound services, that could be useful data to use for your improvement work if it's pertinent to the strategy that you're testing. So here's a sample challenge and strategy that would lend itself well to measurement with administrative data. Let's say that we're operating our program in a community setting and we rely on referrals from partners for our participants. But we feel like our partners aren't sending us young people who match our program's target population. So we're going to develop as our strategy more targeted messaging for partners about our target population. So maybe we develop a few profiles of youth who would match our key target population to give them a better idea. To measure the success of that strategy using administrative data, if we're thinking about process measures, which again is what happened, we could just look at the number of referrals we've received under our new strategy. So did implementing this this new messaging lead to more or fewer referrals from certain partners? To look at our overall outcome, we really want to understand whether this helped to make the referrals stronger. So we could examine the demographics of the participants who are being referred to our program to see if it achieved our intended outcome. Now let's take a look at surveys, which a lot of you are probably using. It sounds like a lot of you are using in the program. If you're measuring your improvement strategies, there are kind of two groups of surveys that you can draw on. The first are your existing tools. So as we've seen in the group chat, a lot of you are already doing things like pre-post surveys or satisfaction surveys. We're including fidelity logs under this as well. And then you have your strategy-specific tools. So sometimes your existing tools are not going to be targeted enough to measure what you need to measure. So in this case, you might need to develop a brief survey to ask questions specifically about your strategy. So as Lauren referred to earlier, exit tickets are a type of targeted strategy. They're usually just 1 or 2 questions. Teachers use these a lot at the end of a lesson to understand what a student learned or to get quick feedback on a lesson. And it's a really great tool to get quick feedback and like a low effort tool to get feedback. So we link to an exit ticket primer in the resource section if you're interested, if you're not familiar with the tool and you want to learn a little bit more about those. Let's look at our sample challenge here if we're going to use surveys. So our challenge now is that staff are struggling to balance discussion and fidelity. Let's say our facilitators are trying to get through all the activities in a lesson in order to maintain fidelity, but they sometimes feel like they have to stifle conversation in order to do that. So our strategy is going to be to bring in the curriculum developer to train staff on how to better balance these considerations. So how could we use surveys to track the success of that strategy? I'm going to go through our thoughts. If you have thoughts and you want to contribute them to the group chat, you can feel free to do that. But as we were thinking about it, as you remember, Lauren went through the 4 types of measures earlier. Your on-track measures are those that tell you whether you're achieving an interim outcome that you believe to be an important driver of your ultimate aim. So in this case, our ultimate outcome is to achieve this balance between fidelity and engagement. So we'll say that we believe an interim outcome is the facilitator's confidence in being able to balance those things. Because if a facilitator feels confident in delivering the curriculum, it's more likely they'll be able to execute it well. And then, so to understand that, we could give a post-training survey to facilitators. So after the training, do they feel more confident in being able to encourage student discussion while also completing your lesson? Or do they feel like they have the skills to find this balance between fidelity and engagement? And this will give us an indication of whether our strategy, which in this case is the training, is promising and is it effective. So this is an example of a strategy-specific survey because it's not something that obviously we were tracking before in any kind of way. But of course, we still need to look at our outcome measures. And we could potentially use existing tools to do that. So we're including, again, fidelity logs as a type of survey. If you're less familiar with fidelity logs, many curricula come with logs to document whether you've implemented all the activities that go along with the lesson. So facilitators are able to self-report on how much of the content they made it through for each lesson. So that's a source that we'll use to understand fidelity, and that's something that we're already tracking. But we also need to hear from students about whether they felt engaged and felt like they had ample time for discussion. For that, we could either create a student survey to gather that information if we feel like we need the feedback right away in order to assess the effectiveness of this strategy. Or if we're close to the end of a cohort, we could just add questions to our existing student satisfaction survey about discussion and engagement. So to measure this strategy, we're using a mix of some of our existing tools while also creating a new survey to get at facilitator confidence. So now we're going to break with a poll. So we're interested in hearing from all of you about the types of surveys that you're currently administering in your program. And I think we got a flavor of that already in the group chat, but now we'll get it through a poll. So what tools are you already using that might be able to support your improvement work? And the choices are just the participant satisfaction survey, a pre-post survey, maybe you're using both of those tools, other, or you're not currently administering surveys to participants. So I'll give a moment to select one of those options. And I see someone suggested a potential data source to look at fidelity and engagement, so that's helpful. So yeah, it looks like some curriculum come with tools that you can use to review that in the observation forms. Let's take a look at our poll results. Okay, so it looks like most of you, so over 50%, administer a pre-post survey, and almost a third do both a satisfaction and a pre-post survey. So no one is not administering any surveys. So it's clear that everyone is very familiar with survey data and hopefully how to apply that to your improvement work. So another key data source is qualitative data collected via interviews and focus groups. So for interviews, there are two kinds. There are one-on-one interviews and group interviews. And the focus groups, of course, always involve multiple people. And I see somebody also suggested, going back to our poll, impact cards are another tool that you could use, which is a type of survey. So thank you for that additional detail. So let's quickly review some of the differences between focus groups and interviews. So both are intended to capture experiences in a more detailed way than you might get through a survey. The main difference between interviews and focus groups is really the role of the moderator. Because in a focus group, if you're moderating, your role is to be a facilitator, and your aim is to encourage discussion between the participants about the topics that you want to discuss. So focus groups tend to work really well if you're trying to elicit opinions or feedback about something. So maybe just a straightforward question, what did you think about our program? And you can ask that to the participants in your program. A focus group would be great to answer that question because there's an added benefit to the information you receive when participants are able to build off of what each other say. Interviews are often one-on-one, but they can be in a group format. And what makes a group interview different from a focus group, again, is your role. Because in a group interview, you're not facilitating the discussion as much, but you're more directing the interview. So you would ask questions and the participants respond. So there's less of a focus there on participants interacting across each other. And because you have more control over how the interview would unfold, group interviews are better when you're trying to understand things like facts and details. So if we're going to use a focus group to get feedback on what participants thought about our program, we might use a group interview format with our facilitators to understand fidelity and how much were they able to maintain fidelity to our lessons. So if we were to ask questions like, which lessons were you able to fully implement? Which lessons were more difficult to get through? You have specific questions in that case that you're looking to answer. So you want to have more control over directing the interview, and it's more fact-based. And of course, many of you are probably familiar with one-on-one interviews. So the advantage of a one-on-one interview is that if you're discussing a sensitive topic, which you may be for programming like this, it allows for more privacy. I think the disadvantage to the one-on-one interview is that if you're looking to get multiple perspectives, it can be very labor-intensive to do one-on-one interviews with multiple participants or other stakeholders. Let's take a look at our sample challenge here. In this case, the curriculum is not resonating with our participants, so we can tell that they're not engaged with our program, and we get some feedback from them that they find it hard to relate to our materials. So our strategy is going to be to make allowable adaptations to align the material better with the population that we're serving. So how could we use focus groups or interviews to understand how this worked? Again, if you want to use the chat, that's fine, and I'm also going to go through our thoughts on this. So we could use an interview to understand what happened. We could interview our facilitators to understand how the adapted materials were presented. For our on-track measures, again, our interim outcomes. We could look at whether students feel like they can relate to the material more. So our ultimate outcome, remember, is engagement, but we think if we make the materials more relatable, this is going to enhance overall engagement. So we could use a focus group because we want opinions from students. So we might ask things like, do you connect more with the revised materials? Or do you have thoughts on how to further improve the materials? And then lastly, for our outcome measure, our ultimate outcome is engagement. So we could use that same facilitator interview to understand whether the facilitators perceived a change in engagement with the students. So we were interested in hearing from all of you about how you've used interviews or focus groups in your program. So for those of you who have done interviews or focus groups, for what purpose have you used them? Or what types of information were you trying to understand, and with whom did you use them? Did anyone use interviews or focus groups? Okay, so to gather student feedback on an activity. Yeah, so it would be a great method to use a focus group to get that type of information. Incentives. Okay, so again, looking to get some feedback from participants about the program. Were the facilitators engaging? That's a great tool. And conducted focus groups with LGBTQ youth to explore inclusivity. Again, that's a great method to get that impact because they can build off of each other and really talk about how they felt. Okay, so it looks like a lot of people are using focus groups and interviews. Community outreach ideas, youth leadership activities. These are all great suggestions. So it's looking like a lot of you have used focus groups and interviews in the past, so you're pretty familiar with this data collection method. So maybe this next part is going to be easy for everyone then. So now we're going to do a little bit of a quiz called interview or focus group. So we're going to present you with 3 scenarios, and we'll run through the 3 scenarios, and we just want to hear from you which of the 3 methods, so that being a one-on-one interview, a group interview, or a focus group, would you use to collect information for this particular scenario? And we recognize there's a lot of gray area here. So sometimes either format is fine, but we just want to hear from you about which do you think would be the best approach? So our first scenario is you're having attendance issues, and you want to hear from chronically absent students about their struggles attending your program. And the purpose of this is that you want to be able to inform supports for them. So which method would you use to get more information about that? Would you use a one-on-one interview, a group interview, or a focus group? And you can see at the top of the poll the scenario again. So I see some of you are using the group chat, which is great too. It makes it easier for everyone to see the poll. So let me go to the results. And yeah, most people, 78% said one-on-one interview, which is what we thought as well. Because this is a scenario where you don't know whether this might involve sensitive subjects. You don't know if students are having personal issues that might prevent them from attending. So yes, as somebody said here in the group chat, it's good for privacy. So for our second scenario, in this case, and this sounds like something that a lot of you have done in the past, you want feedback on a specific lesson in the curriculum. For this, would you use a one-on-one interview, a group interview, or a focus group? So I'm going to show the results of this one so we can keep moving along. And yeah, 75% said focus group, which is also how we felt. You want feedback from a number of students, so you definitely want a group format, and it would be beneficial to hear from them, hear them discuss amongst themselves their differing thoughts. So one final scenario, you want to understand the past experiences that young people have had with sexual risk avoidance programming. So what types of programs have they participated in the past? Which format do you think would be best for that? Okay, so I'm going to look at the results here too. Keep moving, and 50% said group interview. So yeah, you definitely want a group format here. 25% said focus group, which is also fine. You're looking to gather information from several young people. So doing one-on-one interviews here could be challenging, just because if you want to talk to multiple students, that could get really labor intensive. You could really use a group interview or a focus group, but a group interview might give you more control over the direction of the conversation. So you could ask specific things like, what types of programs did you participate in? At what age? How did you get involved in these programs? These are more fact-based questions, so to get them all answered, a group interview format might work nicely here. Okay, and so the last data source that we're going to review is observations. It sounded like some of you are doing observations already as part of your program if you're monitoring fidelity to a specific curriculum. So fidelity observations, the goal there is to have an outside person evaluate the degree to which the lesson was delivered with fidelity, as well as assess other things like quality of delivery and potentially engagement with the material. You can also do observations with a specific goal to inform your improvement work, though. So in this case, instead of specifically looking at fidelity, you might observe the implementation of a new strategy. So you could look for things like, did this strategy work as we expected? How are students responding to it? Are there any unexpected things that are happening? And if you're interested in our resource widget and then also in our resource slides at the end of the presentation, we link to a simple template that you could use for improvement observations. So one final example to wrap up our data source conversation. Our problem here is that we're having difficulty recruiting new partners. Say they're interested in what we're offering, but they don't feel like they have the time to implement. So we decide that with approval from the curriculum developer, we're going to repackage the lessons into shorter sessions spread over a longer period of time. So now instead of 60-minute lessons, let's say we fit them into 45-minute sessions, and that works better for some of our partners. One important thing to measure and to monitor with this strategy would be our balancing measures. So maybe this strategy did help us to recruit a few new partners, so that was a success. But before we really deem the strategy a success, we would need to understand impacts to other parts of the program. So did it have an impact on fidelity? And we could use our fidelity observations that we're likely already doing to monitor fidelity in these shorter sessions and see if facilitators were able to adapt well to this new format and still get through all the activities. So for the last portion of the webinar, we wanted to think through how we would design a measurement plan for an improvement strategy. So we're going to plug in different measures that we discussed, as well as talk about what data collection methods that we would use for a road test that we're planning. So our hope is to pull together everything that we've talked about up to this point and think about what a comprehensive measurement plan might look like. And we'll be asking for a lot of your thoughts on this section. So one thing that we wanted to cover, we talked about this in the first webinar, the foundations of CQI, but if you weren't on it, and just to recap, road tests are essentially pilots of a strategy that you're implementing. You often want to do more than one because the goal is to iterate and improve upon your strategy by collecting feedback on how things went when you test out the new strategy before you take it and implement it program-wide. So they're conducted over a short period of time. They're not intended to help you assess your ultimate outcome necessarily, but instead are focused on assessing implementation. So for road tests, we would be using process measures, on-track measures, and balancing measures. Our outcome measures is something that we would use later when we do bring this program-wide. So good, I'm glad somebody agrees with the strategy about making sessions shorter and the need to evaluate that. Okay, so here is our road test scenario. In this case, we're operating our sexual risk avoidance program for middle and high school age students in a community-based setting after school. So our problem is that students aren't participating in class discussions. Let's say we do some investigating, we talk to our students and facilitators, and we learn that the students don't feel comfortable participating because maybe they're from a lot of different schools, so they're not with their friends, and they don't feel comfortable sharing personal things with each other. So our strategy here is going to be to implement team-building icebreakers at the start of every session in order to try to foster a little bit more group cohesion. So our on-track outcome, our interim aim here, is to enhance group cohesion and connection. And then our ultimate aim is to see if this leads to an increase in engagement with our sessions, so better discussions. So we want to do a road test for this strategy before we adopt it as a new practice because we want to understand on a small scale how it works and whether we need to make refinements before we start implementing this in all of our groups. So we're going to decide to implement this in one of our high school age groups for 6 sessions, and we'll collect data on how it went. So we're going to go back. You did some work already in thinking about the different types of measures that you might collect. We're going to return to that, but we're also going to be asking about what data collection methods you could use to inform this strategy. So say we start implementing these icebreakers in our high school sessions. What are some process measures that you could think of that we could use to understand what happened? So what are some questions that you would ask to understand just strictly what happened? And then afterwards, we want to hear your thoughts about data collection methods you might use to get that information. Any thoughts on what we could ask to understand what happened? Yeah, that's a great, conducting observations is a great method to understand. And yes, did the young people like the games? So that's something, if you were doing an observation, you could try to get a sense for whether they seem to be engaging in icebreakers. Observe the icebreaker. Yeah, so we're definitely going to want to ask for student feedback at some point, and that might come more with our on-track measures, because for our on-track measures, we're trying to understand how the students reacted to it. What did this help them to feel more connected to the group? For our process measures, so a lot of what you're already saying, yeah, so a lot on student feedback, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit on the next slide. Yeah, how often were the icebreakers performed? Absolutely. We might also want to look at, and yes, the nature of the icebreaker, so were the age appropriate. You might want to look at how long they took. Did some work better than others? What were some of the lessons learned about making these activities engaging? How many participated would also be a good piece of information to collect for process measures. So you've already suggested a lot of these, but what does anybody else have other thoughts on on-track measures? So we've already heard about collecting feedback from students about, did this help you to feel more connected, or did this help you to feel engaged? Our ultimate aim is to increase engagement, but we identified a root cause of low engagement to be lack of group cohesion. So that's our on-track outcome. So what are some data collection methods that we could use to assess that? What tools are you using to get feedback from participants in your program? How was attendance after the icebreakers? That actually might be a good way to understand group cohesion, because it's kind of a proxy measure to see whether students want to come and feel engaged. So that's true. Yeah, student feedback about icebreakers using surveys. That's great. So I think you could use surveys. You could potentially use a focus group to collect that information from participants in the program. You could even observe sessions if you wanted to get a sense for whether they seemed more engaged. Or yeah, I like that suggestion, thumbs up or down on the activity, because that's a really simple way. And improvement work is all about creating really simple measures, not very time-intensive or labor-intensive measures, but simple ones. So that's a great one. Yeah, satisfaction surveys and focus groups are kind of what we had come up with. And so let's keep it moving and think about some balancing measures. So again, balancing measures aim to look at impacts to other parts of the program, your potential unintended impacts. So we implement this new strategy, and let's say it worked well. Students are getting to know each other better. Can you think of any unintended impacts that may stem from implementing icebreakers at the start of every session? I love this suggestion, too, about having students grade the icebreakers. That would be really useful feedback to inform going forward how you might design the icebreakers. But what about some potential unintended impacts? What questions might you ask? Kids wanting to talk instead of doing the activity. Yeah, you don't finish your lesson. That would be definitely a concern. If you have a limited amount of time to get through, it takes time out of instruction. Yeah, that's good. Well, you've already suggested the data collection method that I was going to get at. Absolutely, looking at your fidelity logs would be a great option to understand whether or not this strategy is cutting into time to get through all of the activities, because you still need to maintain fidelity to the lesson. Okay, so thank you all for your thoughts on those measures. One of the points that we made in the first webinar that's worth emphasizing is the importance of conducting multiple learning cycles, because unless this is a very simple strategy, you don't just want to do one road test and be done necessarily, because you want to gather feedback not just about what works, but for whom and under what conditions. So some of the reasons that you might do multiple tests. The first is that road tests can start really small. So maybe you have this idea for a strategy, but you're not sure if this is even feasible. You could just test it in one session and do nothing else but gather feedback from your staff about how it happened. Because you're just trying to understand feasibility. Was it feasible to implement? And then if it seems feasible, you could run a second road test where maybe you start collecting some feedback from participants to get an understanding of your on-track outcomes. So does it seem like this is a promising strategy in addition to being feasible? The second reason is that if you notice a problem in an early road test, you want to refine your strategy and test it again. And then the third reason is that you want to build evidence related to effectiveness. So if you're delivering your program in multiple contexts, you want to test the strategy in multiple contexts to ensure you're getting consistently positive results. So let's say we do a road test with our high school age young people and the results look promising. Where else might we run a test to understand whether this strategy is really promising? And we have information below about our context again. With staff, so you definitely want to make sure to get feedback from your staff. They're going to be informing this road test, absolutely, to give you some insights about whether or not this is feasible. Yeah, that's great. We absolutely want to do it with our middle school students as well, if you have the capacity to do multiple road tests. Just because it worked with your older students, it might work differently with your younger group. If somebody said in the chat box, maybe the young people won't be participating in these activities, or you know, they'll get distracted by the activities. So just because something works well for high school students, you don't know how that might work for your younger students. So yeah, it would be great to do it with your middle school youth as well. All right, so let's say we've done a couple of cycles and we've collected our data. After each cycle, you want to analyze what you were able to collect. So let's say we supported our test, we might have done interviews, we might have collected surveys, maybe you drew on administrative data, but you have a lot of data to go through. So when you're looking at your data, some of the questions that you want to ask are, what worked consistently well? What was surprising? If you collected some on-track measures, did you see the results that you expected to see? If challenges came up, how could you resolve those? And this is a great activity to do broadly with your staff, or if you have a CQI team, to do it with your team. So one way to do this is to get your team together and have everyone go through the data first on their own and answer those questions, and then share the responses as a group. So what were some of the common reflections and thoughts? So as a group, you can agree upon steps like, do you need to make any refinements and test the strategy, or are we ready to take this program-wide and implement this in all of our groups? And the benefit of doing the analysis as a group is that it brings multiple perspectives to the analysis. So if you have a program director and a facilitator looking at the same data, they could come to different conclusions just because of their different perspectives, which is why it's nice to have different levels of staff involved in the analysis process. So let's go through a participatory data analysis together. And this is a similar process that you could use with your staff. So when we talked about how we might assess enhanced belonging and group cohesion, many of you suggested doing a survey. So let's imagine that we do that to understand our on-track outcome. We're going to use an exit ticket to ask about connection and belonging after each session. So maybe it's just one question where we say, on a scale from 1 to 10, how connected do you feel to your peers in this class? And we'll have them rate their sense of connection over time. So remember, we're doing this for 6 weeks and 6 sessions. This is not a rigorous study by any means, but let's say we decide to implement this icebreaker in our purple group. So that's where we did the road test. And then our orange group is a concurrent group where we didn't implement this strategy. So we're able to offer some comparison, even though we acknowledge that there could be other factors that are influencing this. So the first question is just a basic question. What are the results showing? I know it might take a moment to process the chart. Oh, somebody answered the second question already. Yeah, and that's the correct. That was our answer as well, yeah. You would not want to scale up yet because you need to look at other data. Yes, so these are average scores. So we're looking at the average rating that students in the cohort gave. And so we have average ratings for our purple group and average ratings for our orange group. Yeah, so right, students in the strategy group had more growth in their sense of connection. And somebody already answered our question that's up here on the slide. So is this enough information? Do you need more information before moving forward with the decision? And yes, you do. First, because it would be a good idea, as we already discussed, you're doing this with your high school age participants, but it would be good to do it with your younger participants as well. But the other reason is that we're only looking at one measurement type here. So we're looking at our on-track measures, but we should also be tracking process measures and balancing measures during our road test as well, because this might show the belonging increased, which is good. But if we maybe talk with our facilitators, we might find out that the icebreakers were really onerous for them to implement, and they felt like it was distracting. So that's something that we need to consider as well before we make a decision about the strategy. The other piece that we want to look at is our balancing measures to understand unintended impacts. So let's do that with this chart. So what this chart is showing, let's say we decide to look at our fidelity logs, as someone had suggested before, in order to examine whether this icebreaker strategy is having an impact on fidelity. And so what this chart is showing is our analysis. So it's showing week 1 through week 6, the percentage of activities that the facilitator was able to implement from each lesson. So what do you conclude from looking at this chart? And I'm sorry, but I should have noted that we note that we implemented the icebreaker strategy during week 3. Yeah. So yeah, there's an issue here with fidelity because this is having an impact on fidelity. So yes, we should change the icebreaker. Right. Right. So this is making it more difficult for the facilitators to get through all of the activities in the lesson. So yeah, we need to fix this before we decide that this strategy works because yes, as you said, it's reducing the number of activities the facilitators are able to get through. So this is one of the reasons why it's important to run multiple cycles to work out issues like this before we commit to a strategy. So when do we know we can stop? One, we want to fix the fidelity issues. So as a lot of you are saying, we need to streamline the icebreakers to take up less time. They're taking up too much time at the beginning of the session right now. And then as we've already discussed, we'd like to test this with our younger students as well to see if we get positive results. If both of those things look fine, then we can scale the strategy up to all of our groups and make this a practice. So if you were on the first webinar, one of the things that we emphasize is that when you're done with road testing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should stop collecting data, because the road test just shows whether the strategy is promising and feasible to implement. But again, the reason you developed this strategy is to address your ultimate challenge, which was an engagement issue. So you want to understand whether this is helping your program to resolve that challenge. So we're going to make this new strategy a practice. So we'll announce it to all the staff. Maybe we'll have the facilitators who took part in the road test share their lessons learned about how to streamline the icebreakers so that they don't take up too much time. And then we're going to continue to monitor whether this new practice helps to enhance engagement. So we actually want to continue to keep an eye on two things. One is our on-track outcome. We want to see if this is still, as we're doing this in all of our groups, is it continuing to have an impact on belonging and connection? And then our ultimate outcome, so our overall aim this whole time was to increase engagement. So now that we've scaled this up to our whole program, have we achieved our aim? So now we are looking at our outcome measure. And so what data might we use for monitoring? So we'll start with the first question, which is, how would we monitor our interim outcome? So during our road test, we handed out exit tickets after every session to measure a sense of belonging. We might not want to continue to do that for every session going forward because that's a lot of extra data collection if you're going to be doing this with all of your groups and you're going to be doing this long term. So are there existing tools or methods that you could use to assess belonging? Or how do you get feedback from students now? And I'm just now seeing the suggestion to tie your icebreaker into the activity. That would be a great way to strengthen the strategy. So how could you collect feedback from students? In this case, you're trying to understand their sense of connection to others, to their peers in the group. Yeah, focus groups would be a great way to do it. So some of the things that we thought of student satisfaction surveys, definitely doing focus groups at the end. So if you're already doing a post-program focus group, as some of you said earlier in the webinar that you are, you could add a question about belonging to your existing focus group. And that seems to be the collective decision about what would be the best method, which I agree. I think you would get the best information that way. The key is to try to build questions about belonging into your existing data collection processes so that you don't have to do additional data collection that you would have to continue long term. So for road tests, you often do have to do additional data collection because you need to intensively measure something related to your strategy. But that's only for a short period because road tests are supposed to be short studies. But here, as we've already implemented this as a practice, we're just monitoring it. So we want to look to our existing tools and see whether we can use those to continue to keep an eye on this. So for our ultimate aim, we'll go through this quickly because we're running out of time, but what about assessing whether engagement continues to be a problem? What tools do you use to assess engagement during your sessions? I think someone earlier, okay, yeah. I was going to say, I remember somebody earlier in the chat saying that they use observations. So yeah, that would be a great tool that you could use because a lot of you said you were already doing fidelity observations. So if there's a rating on your form that gets at engagement, then that's a great tool to use because again, it doesn't require you to add any data collection. So you're already doing it, and it's a way to continue to keep an eye. And yeah, you could also do a survey to ask students about whether they feel more engaged, or use your satisfaction survey. So those are all great suggestions. Okay, so this is our final group chat. Let's say that for our tools, we decide to do a post-program focus group, and we're going to use that as a way to continue to monitor group cohesion. And so this is our on-track outcome. So we add a question about belonging and connection to those focus groups that we were already doing, and that's how we're going to continue to keep an eye on belonging. The results are promising. So here's the key themes that come out of those focus groups. The young people feel icebreakers are fun. They feel like they help them to relax before getting into heavier conversations. The icebreakers helped participants to get to know each other. So that's all positive feedback. It seems like the young people are responding well to the icebreaker strategy itself. But now we're going to look at engagement ratings from our observations, as somebody suggested. Let's say we're already doing the fidelity observations and we have a rating on our form. So here, what this chart is showing are several cohorts. So we have cohorts A through F. Cohorts A and B are showing engagement ratings that were measured prior to implementing this new practice. And then cohorts C, D, E, and F are showing groups where we did this icebreaker strategy. So the new practice was already in place at that time. So our question is, if this is showing the ratings of participant engagement from our observation forms, from before, so that's A, B, to after, so that's C through F, are we having an impact on engagement through this new strategy? So is the strategy helping us to meet our aim? And as, again, our specific aim was to increase engagement post-change by an average of 1 point, but you might not actually have to calculate it. You could also just look at the trend line. So if we implemented it in, is each letter a different cohort? Yeah, I'm sorry for the confusion there. Each letter is a different cohort. So yeah, maybe not as correct. We see some increase. So cohort C, where we first implemented, was higher engagement, but then there's not a consistent increase in engagement. So yeah, so we didn't reach our ultimate aim. So what do we do about this? Do you maintain the practice? Do you abandon it? How would you react to getting this information? That's true. That's a good comment. Sometimes it's based on the different personalities of the cohort group. Yeah, it might not work consistently the same way in every group. So that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. So find something else. That leads in well to our ultimate recap. I want to wrap up because we're getting towards the end of the time. So our recap in looking at this is that we did not meet our ultimate aim. But the road tests were promising. So someone says keep it because the students like the icebreakers. So we came away with a similar conclusion here. So the students are sharing positive feedback. This is helping to build belonging because we got really positive feedback from our focus groups. It just doesn't seem to be enough to see an uptick in engagement. So it might still be a good strategy because the students like it. So we're going to make the decision to keep it. But we need to try a new strategy to continue to work on our engagement problem because we haven't fully resolved our engagement issue. And these are all good points. There's a lot of, this isn't necessarily going to work the same way in every cohort. So these are the nuances of how this works in different sessions that you would need to track, which is why it's important to track all 4 of these types of measures so you can truly understand what happened. So in our case, though, we're going to decide to keep the strategy because students did respond well to it. But we're going to go back to our root cause analysis to maybe look at some of the other causes that could be driving strong engagement. Because maybe it's going to take more than one strategy to see an uptick in engagement, or there could be something else that's preventing strong engagement. So we need to go back and iterate again to try to improve. So one final note before we get to our questions, I did want to note that with all the stopping and pausing about the whole universe of measures you could collect, it may feel like this is a lot of work just to test an icebreaker strategy. But you have to think about what we ultimately decided to do, which was to pilot this for six sessions, hand out exit tickets. We're going to talk with our facilitators at the end of the 6 sessions about how it went, and we're looking at fidelity logs. And that's it. So the road tests are really intended to be light lifts. Again, and Lauren mentioned this point at the beginning, it's not really about collecting perfect data. It's about collecting just enough data to determine whether we're making an improvement to our program model, because that's our ultimate aim with all of this work. And so that's what we're trying to do. So with that, I want to go to our questions so that we make sure that we have time for that. And thank you all for your participation.
Great. Hi, all. This is Heather Zaveri, also from the SRAENE team. Thank you, Annie and Lauren, for lots of great information on using measurement within continuous quality improvement. We have just over 5 minutes before 4:30, so we have a few minutes to take questions folks may have. If you have any questions for either Lauren or Annie, please enter them into the Q&A box within ON24, and I will post them to them. And if you enter your question in the group chat, that's fine too. I also have that up so I can see it in either one. So whichever is easiest for you is fine. But if it goes into the Q&A, it'll just come to our team. I'm not seeing any questions come in, so I'm going to run through the next couple of slides just because we're getting close on time. And then if a question comes in as we're doing the wrap-up slides, we will try to answer it. So in addition to all the content today, I wanted to call your attention to some resources that you can link to once the slides are posted on the SRAENE.com website, or if you access the slides through the resource widget in ON24. Some of these resources look very familiar because they are resources we covered during our last webinar. So you can get information on some general resources to support your continuous quality improvement work. You can also get links to what road test is to different types of continuous quality improvement, as well as a template for an observation for improvement. There's also links to resources if you want to do online collaboration. We appreciate everybody who joined the office hours we held last week. We held 2 sessions where folks who attended got to experience some online collaboration using a tool called Mural, and they got to practice some of the tools and activities we had talked about on our webinar back in June. So here are links to those online collaboration tools if you are interested in trying them out yourselves. In terms of next steps, we want to note that we are available, as always, for additional support. You may send an email to SRAETA@Mathematica. We're always monitoring that, and we can respond to you that way. You can also reach out to your project officer who can put you in touch with our team. And then we will be holding another set of office hours. So on August 10th, you will be receiving invitation, or you will be receiving an invitation for office hours that we'll be holding on August 10th from 3 to 4. Those office hours are intended for a time for you to bring us questions. So if you are, doing CQI within your program and want to talk through what you guys are struggling with, where your questions are, we encourage you to come and bring those questions to the office hours. We will also probably have an activity to kind of try out some of these, test out and further understand the types of measures we talked about today. So those office hours, again, are August 10th from 3 to 4. The invitation is forthcoming. And then the next webinar in this series will be on Tuesday, August 18th. And the topic for that webinar will be on building an improvement culture. So as I have been going through these last slides, I have gotten a couple of questions that have come in. And so let me pose these to the team. One question we had, I see, is do we have samples of questions or observation strategies that can be used? Annie or Lauren, can one of you address that?
We could certainly provide some sample questions. If you're able to attend the webinar, maybe we could come with some samples or strategies. Is there anything in particular that you're curious about with observation strategies?
That question came in through the group chat. So whoever was asking about samples for questions or observation strategies, if you want to chat in, if you have looking for something more specific, I will watch for that to come in.
I mean, I can say one general strategy. Oh, sorry, Heather.
Yeah, go for it. Nope, go for it.
A general strategy is to have a form going into it. So you want to make sure that if you have multiple people observing sessions, that they're all looking for the same things. So you want to have a standard form. And if you're doing a fidelity observation, you're already going to have that. But then you also want to take the time to train the people who are observing to make sure that they're trained in what they should be looking for. But certainly if you have more specific questions, we could get back to you on that, or we could address it during the office hours.
Yes, so if you would still like more information, you can send an email and we are happy to work to provide some more specific examples. You can send that to the SRAETA.com website. Another question that just came through again was, just to reiterate, the August 18th webinar is going to again focus on continuous quality improvement, and that the specific topic is going to be on building an improvement culture. So really, what does it look like? What does it take to build improvement work into your ongoing program and programming for your program, and we're also hopefully going to have a few grantees who have been doing this talk about their own experiences as part of the webinar. So we are just about at time, so I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. This has been great information. Please attend the office hours. You'll be getting an invitation for that for August 10th, and also you'll be getting an invitation for the third CQI focused webinar on August 18th, focused on building an improvement culture. Thanks all.